Welcome to Essential Drawing. Form, an element of art. A three-dimensional shape. Objectives for this lesson include accurately drawing a variety of forms based on familiar shapes, imagining a single light source to render form, and to practice cross-contour shading. For this lesson you will need a pencil and an eraser. Let's begin. We'll start by drawing a series of basic geometric shapes, that is, shapes that have names. We'll need a square, two triangles, we'll use equilateral triangles, also a circle, for a form different from that which we render using a square, we'll use a rectangle. And then there are all the other shapes, shapes without names, non-geometric shapes. We sometimes call these organic shapes. So from the square, we'll draw a cube. Now there are many ways to draw a cube, at least 4 that I'm familiar with. But to do so, we have to start with a square. I like to think about the top and the side of a cube as being parallelograms. Notice that the top and bottom side of the cube's right side are parallel diagonals, just as the top side of the cube is made of parallel relationships as well. The left and right edges of the top side are the same parallel diagonals. We'll use a light source coming from the top and also from the left. So the side on the right of our cube will be the darkest side. Since the front of the cube is not facing up and light is usually strongest from above, we'll make the front of our cube our midtone or medium value. I like to shade beyond the line sometimes and then clean up around the edges to make sure that I shade all the way to the edges of a side of a flat plane. And then the top of our cube will stay light. I'll just add a cast shadow next to the cube so that it appears to be resting on a flat surface. Cast shadows are not necessarily part of this lesson, but it is worth noting that they're darker the closer they are to the object that casts them, and they fade away as they get farther from their original object. Let's move on to the first triangle. The first equilateral triangle, we'll start by drawing what looks like a capital letter A. We don't need the base or bottom of our triangle, and instead we'll vertically bisect our triangle with what is the forward corner of a pyramid. Now I'm going to shade in the pyramid according to the same light source, but I'm going to shade in strokes that are diagonal and follow the direction of the pyramid's base. and that's cross contour shading, where we shade in a direction that demonstrates the changing plane or the direction in which a plane passes through space, a plane being a flat surface. In the same direction, I'll also add in some small, nearly horizontal lines, and we'll turn this small pyramid into a tiny stone pyramid, just for fun. Notice that the vertical cracks between the blocks lean towards the point of the pyramid. Now there's another form that we can create from the equilateral triangle. Of course, it won't have flat planes, it is the cone. In order to change our triangle into a cone, I'll erase the bottom edge of our triangle and add two tiny curves, what look like two little parentheses, to the bottom legs of our pyramid. And we want to make sure that the curve that we fit between those two parentheses bottoms out directly under the point of the cone. Now the surface of the cone is constantly changing, just like the sphere and the cylinder that we'll draw after the sphere. So in order to shade in a cross-contour fashion, my strokes will also have to change direction very quickly as they wrap or move around this surface. You'll notice that my strokes follow the direction of the base directly below them. The darkest strokes are at an angle downward towards the left. The strokes in the center of the cone are level, and the lighter strokes along the left side of the pyramid angle downward towards the right, just as does the curve that make the bottom edge of our cone. All right, I'll draw another circle now, one that we'll shade in. I like to draw a number of circles very lightly, and somewhere in between those 3 or 4 circles that I've sketched in is a good circle, a winner. So I'll go ahead and find those lines that best represent a sphere and darken those. For consistency, we'll keep our light source in the top left. If you're following along, I'm sketching in some rings or zones in which to shade around the sphere. If you're following along, keep these lines very light. We'll want them to disappear in the value of our sphere. These zones are to identify the highlight, the lightest zone, a light gray, then a medium gray, and finally the core of the shadow. The sliver of a zone along the bottom right of our sphere will be what's called reflected light, sometimes bounced light. That would be light that does in fact bounce off the surface on which this sphere rests and reflect back into the dark side of the sphere. I'll start out with strokes that follow the direction of the curve. They're straighter through the middle and lean around the contour of the curve as we move from the center out. And I'll lighten my pressure from the dark side to the light side. Now, I want to blend these strokes together so they're lighter than my intention, and I'll continue to build them up and shade slightly in different directions from the cross contour directions that I started with, just to even out those strokes, as it's hard to lay in smooth strokes that weave together on a curved surface. I want to build up the contrast between the midtone and the light, and now I'll start to find or rediscover the core of our shadow, the darkest dark. Once it's in place, I'll soften the edges of that zone so that it incorporates into the medium values around it. I want to be careful not to include the darkest value all the way against the bottom right edge. I want to retain that reflected light. It helps to further illustrate this illusion of form that we're trying to create. In order to incorporate a darker value into a lighter value, you need to work your pencil's tip along that border very, very lightly. Only use as much pressure as necessary to subtly see a change, as though you're polishing the values. Let's go ahead and move on to the next object. It's a cylinder, and it includes a circle for a top, or an ellipse. An ellipse is a circle tilted in space, just like this roll of tape. In order to change our rectangle into a cylinder, we'll need to correctly draw an ellipse around the top. It's worth noting that the back half, or the farthest half of an ellipse, farthest from us that is, appears slightly smaller and flatter than would the front half of an ellipse, that is, the portion of the circle that's closest to us. I'll go ahead and draw a little guideline down from the bottom side of my rectangle. I want to find the exact center so that the curve that we use to create the bottom edge of our cylinder is not lopsided. In fact, it's symmetric. There. Now I'll use that curve as a guide to start the ellipse that will become the top side of our cylinder. I'm going to go ahead and create some aiming points and zoom in so that you can see that the aiming point for the lower portion of the ellipse is very slightly farther away from the original rectangle's top side, which in this case acts as an equator to divide our ellipse into the two halves. And the farther portion of the ellipse is just slightly smaller, slightly flatter. We want to make sure that the outermost points of our ellipse are in fact not points, but remain a true curve. Ellipses do not look like footballs or eyeballs. With our light source in place, I've gone ahead and shaded in the different zones of gray in a cross contour fashion, and now I'll just work the very edge of the border between a darker and a lighter value to weave those separate values together into a uniform surface with an ever-changing amount of light. Just polishing the border or the seam between two separate values until they begin to mingle together with smaller and smaller strokes, barely touching the paper. Fading out to white is the most challenging transition of all. All right. Using our knowledge now of how to draw and render using value geometric forms, let's tackle an organic form. This requires imagination. Since my organic form kind of looks like a blobby cloud, it's not going to have sharp corners like the pyramid or cube. I'll have to build up my value to create a gradation across the surface from light to dark, and with this bump on the top, it'll be initially shaded in as a separate form and then again married or mingled together with the larger, wider portion of the form below. So I've found my general shadows where the darkest shadows are going to be. They'll eventually become even darker. And I want to notice that on the other forms on the page, there's very little, if any, white space. Maybe just 5 or 10% of the forms remaining with white space. That will encourage me to go darker on this form from my imagination so that in fact the majority of it is some kind of a gray once I'm finished. I like the idea of reflected light or bouncing light, so I'll leave a mid-tone along the bottom edge of my organic form. Almost finished. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson on the Element of Art form. Be sure to watch the remaining videos in the series Essential Drawing.